Hi, Tony. Peter Larson here. So glad you're able to spend a few minutes talking to me and talking to my readers at the Ottawa Forum on Israel-Palestine.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Peter.
Tony, I know you for having been a senior person at the CBC many years ago, and then you headed up, you left CBC or invited by Al Jazeera to head up their English language network, which at that time was quite a radical break. Just tell us a little bit about that transition.
Well, I mean, my background primarily was at the CBC for more than 3 decades, and I covered. I did a lot of work, although I was executive producer of the National, I did documentaries for the Journal. I did a lot of work internationally, including in the Middle East, and with various CBC reporters, I went in and out of Lebanon, Israel, Syria many times. So I always found myself fascinated by the region. Then back in Toronto, I came to the end of my career and said, okay, time to move on. And then a year or so after that, after I left the CBC, Al Jazeera contacted me, and they felt their English channel was a bit in trouble. They wanted some help, and so I agreed to be their managing director, and I worked with them for about 4 years. So, which was a fascinating experience, and allowed me to get back into the Middle East in different ways, but from a different perspective, which was from the vantage point of Al Jazeera, which, as we all know, is an incredibly important media institution in the Middle East.
It is indeed, and so that brings us to the main topic here to discuss, the death, murder, assassination, however it be characterized, of Shireen, the Al Jazeera reporter who was killed in Jenin a couple of days ago. Tell me, I understand you did meet her when you were with Al Jazeera a couple of times. What do you remember of meeting her?
Yeah, I mean, I've met her, I think, 3 or 4 times. As the head of the English network, my role was to travel to bureaus and kind of assess how the conditions were, et cetera. And obviously, our bureau in Jerusalem and in Israel and Palestine was incredibly important. So I went in and out of that bureau a variety of times. And although Shireen primarily worked for, well, I think more than 2 decades for the Arabic service, it was an integrated bureau, and so I met her as I visited the bureau, and we chatted a couple of times. But the thing that I do recall so much about her, apart from the fact that she's a very charming, was a very intelligent, actually a very funny lady, she also was just revered as a journalist in the Arab world, among Palestinians. She was well loved, extremely well loved by her colleagues. I mean, she was just one of these wonderful people that you sense right from the word go. And I think that her legacy, and I think which largely explains the devastation that I think is being felt now among Arabs in general, but certainly among Palestinians, is that her role for 27 years was really to portray the human story of the Palestinian people as it evolved over the years and through the decades in such an incredibly difficult situation. And she just really felt incredibly empathetic with her audience, with other Palestinians. And she was the senior correspondent for Al Jazeera Arabic in covering the Palestinian territories. And she was like in the home of the Arab world probably 2 or 3 times a week for more than 2 decades. So in that sense, her killing and her loss really is being felt, I think, as a loss to a family, and it really is devastating.
There have been many since her killing. There have been a number of reports reminding us that she's not the first. That there have been many journalists, many Palestinian journalists, but others as well, killed in Israel or in Israel-Palestine over the last many years. What was your awareness from the Al Jazeera point of view of the dangers that your reporters faced in trying to giving decent coverage to the Israel-Palestine issue?
I think, and I think the situation has become worse in recent years, because I think to a certain extent the Israeli military seems to feel that it now has carte blanche to do these things, and most importantly to get away with doing these things. I mean, our experience at Al Jazeera was that there was always obviously a tension with Israeli military forces and with the government in general, for probably what would be obvious reasons. But our point to them, and the point of Al Jazeera to the Israeli government and to other governments in the region, was that they have a job to do. They're journalists. They're trying to cover situations, stories. And I think what was clearly sensitive to the Israelis was that with Al Jazeera covering these stories so closely as it did, that it often was able to portray the Israeli military forces in ways that they did not want the wider world to see. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think there has been. I don't think there's any doubt that Al Jazeera journalists, and in many cases journalists in other organizations as well have been targeted by the Israeli military, and I think it's always been a very fraught kind of relationship, and you know, the culmination has happened last Wednesday in the killing of Shireen.
Apart from actually murdering people or killing people, yeah. Was there? Are you aware of intimidation in other ways? I mean, I am aware of the fact that in Gaza, last year, a building that was housed Al Jazeera's offices in Gaza was destroyed. Nobody got killed, as far as I know, but that right. I have to assume that that's an act of intimidation.
Oh yeah, no. I think if anything, I think intimidation was probably a 24/7. Approach. And I mean, it's not as if they kill journalists every day, but they sure as hell tried to intimidate and to frighten and to coerce journalists. Not only Al Jazeera journalists, but certainly Al Jazeera was at the top of the list. And I think that the sad thing about the situation now is that it kind of happened figuratively, or these things are happening figuratively in the dead of night. You know, they're not being noticed by the wider world. So in that sense, there seems to be a certain carte blanche sense on the part of the Israeli military. And so I think that there's been, and what it creates among journalists is tension as to, are you taking your life in your hands by covering a story? And most journalists are there, you know, without a political agenda. They're just trying to kind of provide a portrait of what's happening. And if you get into a situation of where you don't know whether, if you go around the next corner, you might be killed, as was the case with Shireen last Wednesday morning, then that becomes incredibly fraught and incredibly tense. And I think that, again, is the intention of the Israeli military forces, is to create a kind of a culture of fear. And I think the only solution, I think, by the wider world is to hold these forces accountable for whatever actions they in fact take.
Tony, this may be a little bit unfair, reaching back into your earlier life, but those of us who are concerned about Palestinian human rights also feel that mainstream media, including the CBC, kind of underplays this and tends to give a lot of play to the Israeli point of view. I don't have a question here to formulate. It's an observation, and maybe you want to agree or disagree. Or
I agree. I mean, I think it's been a problem. I think people tend to respond to, and including media organizations, tend to respond to the loudest critics, and I think that one could fault the Israeli authorities and the Israeli government for a variety of things, but they are quite expert in turning the screws on media organizations, or quite frankly on governments. And what I found when I was at the CBC, that we would be inundated with carefully orchestrated campaigns by pro-Israeli sources attacking our journalism. Often, I mean, virtually every time, the criticisms were specious and phony and untrue, but they occupied time. They occupied my day. They forced you to respond to them. Whereas the other side was relatively silent, and I think as that happens year after year, then what you do get is you get a kind of a feeling within newsrooms, and I think that applies in Canada, and it certainly applies in the States and probably in parts of Europe, where people begin to wonder if I'm going to take on this Israeli issue, I'm going to create all sorts of grief, so maybe the best
thing for yourself.
Yeah, for yourself in terms of criticism, in terms of having to explain, having to deal with specious criticisms that require research to rebut. And I think that what tends to happen, and I sense this as an outsider, as I watch and as I listen and as I read media coverage, is I get the sense in some newsrooms that people just say, look, let's just avoid this topic. We don't have the time to deal with this grief. And in that sense, the Israelis, I think, succeed in getting that kind of pressure. So I think we all have to, those of us who care about a balanced look at that region, have to kind of insist that we get from our media organizations a balanced treatment, not only one that responds to the noisiest side.
Sure. Okay. Tony Burman, your great depth of experience, both as a journalist and manager at CBC and with Al Jazeera, gives you an interesting perspective on this. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us today, and look forward to talking to you again some other time.
Thank you very much, Peter. Take care.